where the indirect and offset functions will return references to you. The row, rows, column, columns, and cell functions will each give you different details about an inputted reference. The row, rows, column, and columns functions are fairly straightforward, so let's start there. Each of these functions is about figuring out either where in a worksheet a reference is located or how wide or tall that reference is. This information can be useful for various tasks, such as preparing print ranges, aligning charts as inputs into indirect or offset functions, or even simple informational purposes. I'll use our exercise 3 workbook, just like with the indirect function, to work through these functions and what they do. The row and column functions each tell you either the row or column of the first cell in a given reference. If I type equals row D5, I'll get 5 since D5 is in row 5. The result here is fairly obvious. Now, if I look at the function, the reference is actually optional. That's kind of interesting. What happens if I type equals row into my cell and press enter? In this case, I get 4 because I'm in row number 4. This answer will always be the row number of the cell that contains the function itself. So if I copy it down, it increases by 1. If I copy it to the right, the value doesn't change. The column function works identically to the row function. Instead of giving you the letter name of the column, it gives you the column as a number. So column A is 1, B is 2, and so on. Column D5 gives us 4, since D is the 4th column. And column without a reference tells us where our current cell is. It can be difficult to find good examples for these functions, but we can update our line match to use this row function. Let's imagine that your boss has come through and modified the line item to be a text field that has a period in it for nicer printing and comes and yells at you because now the invoices are broken. You explain the problem to him that you rely on that number, and he says, well, too bad, you need to do it a different way. Well, we can take advantage of the fact that the lines go from 1 to 6 and replace the AND part of our line match function with row minus row offset. So let's think about what that means and why I made it so complex, including the offset and L8 and all that. Well, the row part should be pretty obvious. It will update by 1 going down so that the current row will always be 1 greater than the previous row. Now the current row for the first entry is 8. So your first thought might be, well, why don't I just subtract 7 from all of them? But let's think ahead for a moment. What happens if rows get inserted above that cell and it gets moved down to row 9? The next logical idea might be to say row L7, so that insertions above L7 push that reference down too, and everything still works. But we still have one case left open. An insertion at row 8 would still cause it to break, since now L7 would not get shifted down. So the offset by -1 tells our row function to use the reference directly above our starting point. In this way, we can never be separated and will always start at a value of 1. The rows and columns, plural versions, will tell you how many rows or columns are in a given array. Again, these functions have fairly selective uses and will pop over to our baseball data for this particular set. Remember, we used an offset function to analyze only the cells with populated data. What we could do to help us perform a check would be to include a rows E5 to E26 in one cell and a count of E5 to E26 in another cell. This would give us an indication as to how many cells contain data out of the total number of cells in the array. Alternatively, we could have a rows function that contained the same offset function to tell us our sample size by simply copying and pasting it into our rows function. The rows and columns functions will be a little bit more useful with dynamic named ranges in our next lesson. For now, let's move back to our other worksheet and into the cell function. The cell function is almost a purely informational function. It takes the upper leftmost cell passed as a reference, or the cell that the function is in, and returns one of a dozen different options. What do these options tell us? Well, the first parameter, info type, is a constant option, and you can see the list of values. Due to the nature of most of the values, many of which I've never actually used, this function is generally used as just informational or for certain debugging purposes. For example, the address property could be useful with dynamic named ranges to identify where they might be evaluating to if you're having problems with them. Otherwise, they simply tell you what you already know. The file name property is nice as a display in footers when printing. And finally, the type property is nice for checking whether Excel thinks a cell is blank, a value, or a string. Blanks will show up as B, strings as L, and values as V. But even these are of limited value, as there are better functions for testing errors and numbers. But again, these can be useful for auditing. The row and column functions will prove to be very nice support functions, and perhaps you'll be one of the people who finds the cell function particularly useful. Personally, I use it most regularly for the file name property, but that's really about it. We'll bring these together with our indirect and offset functions in our next lesson, where I'll teach you how to create dynamic named ranges and how to use them effectively.